So in Laboratory 8, we're doing muscles of the upper limb. Now, some of these, this is getting really challenging now because we've got a whole lot of muscles occurring in the upper limb, and many of them occur over two joints. So you notice as you look through the tables in these weeks, you may have a muscle that appears on a lot of different tables or many different tables. That means it indicates it's a two-joint muscle, or it's crossing over two joints, meaning it might have an action at one joint and an action at a different joint. And those actions can be completely different. But you'll notice they still have the same origin and insertion. So just keeping in mind the muscle's origin insertion won't change, but depending on what joint we're talking about, the action could change. So just to revise on what the muscles, we'll start with the glenohumeral joint. Remembering what the glenohumeral joint does, it flexes, which is drawing the arm forward like this, and extends. It can abduct and adduct. And we go medial and lateral rotation, which is drawing that to the glenohumeral joint on itself, like on the long axis, and also laterally. We've got horizontal adduction, which would be drawing my arm across when it's already up in that elevated position. Horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. The other thing to consider here is as we talk about muscles of the glenohumeral joint, I'm going to be using the arm model for a lot of this, but keeping in mind that a lot of these muscles are also occurring on that trunk. So it's a combination of what we're learning this week as well as some of the muscles we learned last week. So now we're going to look at the specific muscles of the glenohumeral joint using the models. And we'll start with the pectoralis major, this large muscle on the front part of your chest, upper front part of your chest. Now you notice for starters with the pectoralis major, we've got this broad origin from the clavicle, sternum and across the ribs. And it's attaching to the front of the humerus, which is important for the actions. And you can see in your insertion part the exact parts of the humerus that it would be inserting into. Now, because of this broad origin, you'll see fibers in a lot of different directions, which means it's got a lot of different actions. The main actions here are horizontal adduction. So look at most of the fibers are heading across that way. So if the arm was out here, would horizontally adduct across. That is really one of the main roles of the pectoralis major, that horizontal adduction. It also plays a big role if my arm is abducted to adduct it in. So it's a joint agonist with latissimus dorsi for adduction. But there are some other actions. There are fibers just in this superior portion that are running largely sort of almost up and down. So it also plays a role in flexion. And of course, as it's attaching to the front of the humerus, it's going to play a role in medial rotation of the humerus. Medial rotation, of the humerus of the glenohumeral joint. And here we've got latissimus dorsi traveling from the iliac crest, lumbar and thoracic vertebrae, up into the front of the humerus again. So it's tucking under our arm and attaching to a very similar position to that pectoralis major. Similar position to the pectoralis major on the front means it will do some slight medial rotation as well, and also some horizontal abduction. But the main role, or the agonist role of this latissimus dorsi is extension of the shoulder. So when we're drawing that shoulder downwards, it plays a main role or an agonist in shoulder extension. It also plays a main role, or it's an agonist of adduction along with that pectoralis major. So it's on the inside, there are two very big muscles on the inside of the trunk attaching to the arm. So when we're in that abducted position, they will both work together to abduct my shoulders in, or my glenohumeral joint in. So here we've got the deltoid. Now the deltoid does almost all the movements of the glenohumeral joint. Almost all, because it doesn't do adduction. And in order to do abduction, it would need to be on the inside, which it's clearly not. So it doesn't play a role. But the front fibers, the middle fibers, and these back fibers means it can do a whole range of actions. The front ones being flexing and extending on the back, abduction on the side. It plays roles in rotation both ways, and also horizontal adduction and abduction. The main reason for this is it's got a very, very large or broad origin, wrapping all the way around the top part of the shoulder girdle, and then inserting into a very specific point on the humerus. So before learning the muscles as we continue down the arm, let's touch on some of the bony landmarks that will help us with the origins and insertions for these muscles. So we'll start with the ones that we know and we've used before. We've got the coracoid process, the acromion, and the glenoid cavity. And then we move to our fossas. We've got the subscapular fossa, which is the fossa, the big, broad fossa that's underneath the scapula. We flip it over the back. We've got the spine of the scapula with the supraspinous fossa and the infraspinous fossa. Above and below our glenoid cavity, we've also got two little tubercles. The one above is called the supraglenoid tubercle, which is a little lump on top, and the infraglenoid tubercle, which is a little lump on the bottom. So when we look at the humerus, we know we're looking at the front of a right humerus. Distinguishing features here were that olecranon fossa at the back, and we've got the more broader or larger, sticking out more, the medial epicondyle of the humerus with the lateral epicondyle of the humerus out this side. At this end of the humerus, up near the head, we've got two tubercles. We've got the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle of the humerus, and then the groove that runs between them is called the intertubercular sulcus. Now looking at the back of the left arm, and we know we're looking at the back because you can see that spine running across the back of the scapula, and the deltoid, which I've removed, would run right up to that spine. So if we remember their fossa names, the muscles around this area, being referred to as the rotator cuff muscles, which is a group of 4 muscles, derive their name largely from their fossas. So above the spine, we've got the supraspinatus muscle. Below the spine, infraspinatus muscle. So supra meaning above, infra meaning below. So supraspinatus, infraspinatus, if you were to slow those words down and give it a bit more meaning. You can see here, these different elements of the muscle give you the idea it could be a different muscle, but it's not. It's actually the same muscle coming from this real broad origin right here, narrowing down. So you've got supraspinatus, infraspinatus. On the back, also going to the same point, which is that greater tubercle of the humerus, you've got the teres minor. So the teres minor forming part of that rotator cuff as well. If we flip the arm over, on the inside, you've got this really broad origin, narrowing right down to the lesser tubercle of the humerus. You've got what we call the subscapularis. So they're the 4 rotator cuff muscles. Going over them one more time, using the spine as the reference, you've got supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis underneath, and then teres minor. Those 4 muscles largely rotating and stabilizing the shoulder. This 5th one here that I haven't mentioned before is called the teres major. So it shares a similar name to the teres minor, but it doesn't form part of that rotator cuff. You can see here the origin is similar, but the insertion is much lower. So it doesn't form part of that 4 rotator cuff. So rotator cuff are just the 4: supraspinatus, infraspinatus, subscapularis around the whole inside, and then finally teres minor. Teres major, the next muscle in the line here, is beneath and does not form part of that rotator cuff. So I won't talk about every single action for all the arm muscles because sometimes there's a lot, but I will comment on the actions of the rotator cuff. So these ones occurring on the back. Remember, we're looking at the back of the arm. So you've got the infraspinatus and teres minor play a role in externally rotating the arm or the glenohumeral joint. So that's like turning your arm towards the back, so external rotation. To counter that, on the inside, the subscapularis medially rotates our glenohumeral joint. So think about it, it's attaching to the front. This will cause the shoulder to medially rotate. Whereas the supraspinatus on top, it's running across the top and plays a role in shoulder abduction. So I'm going to teach you this arm in the order of the muscles from just sort of top to bottom in a nice order that connects these muscles together. That's going to largely be a different order to the order presented in your book, which is in the order of different joints. So you'll see a difference there, but it'll all come together by the end. So when we talk about the upper arm, what we're talking about is the brachial region. That brachial region means upper arm, which means all the muscles in this upper arm area often have that reference of brachial in there somewhere. For example, the bicep brachii, we already see that brachial, bi meaning 2 heads, so 2 origins for the bicep brachii. That's where it derives its name, from the 2 origins plus the brachial region. If we remove that, underneath that, we've got the coracobrachialis, traveling from the coracoid process, which is that process at the front of the scapula, into the brachial region. So coracobrachialis. Square in the middle of the brachial region, we've got the brachialis. So it's a deeper muscle underneath the bicep brachii. And if we rotate the arm further, touching that brachialis, you see that starting then traveling down the radius side of the arm, you've got the brachioradialis. If I turn this over to the back of my upper arm would be referred to as the tricep brachii. It's got 3 different heads, meaning tricep brachii, so it comes from that three origins in the brachial region. And then the most difficult to see would be this one right across the elbow here. This is called the anconeus. And it often derives its name similar to Anconia, which is in Italy. A lot of people think of the anconeus as the elbow of Italy, because if you thought about this entire arm as the shape of Italy, which kind of does look a little bit like a boot, right around here at the elbow, you've got a city called Anconia, and here we've got the muscle called anconeus. So it occurs right across the back of your elbow. So remembering that muscles that are across the front of a joint, as these ones do here, they result in flexion. So these ones here are going to flex the arm. Moving down, you see the brachialis starts here, so it only plays a role down here at the elbow, but it's crossing in front of the elbow, so it's going to flex. If we cross over, you've got the tricep brachii. It's on the back. It's connecting to the scapula, so it's going to play a role in shoulder extension because it connects to both the scapula, but then also crosses the elbow, so it will extend the elbow. The anconeus here, little one across the back of the elbow, it's going to be a synergist in elbow extension. Nowhere near as big as this tricep in terms of extending the elbow, but it's still going to play a role in extension there as well. So now we're looking at the muscles here in the lower arm, crossing the wrists and fingers, and it's really important to understand where the origins are. And you'll see for a lot of those flexor muscles, you've got the common origin being the medial epicondyle of the humerus. So right on that medial epicondyle, and you can feel that if you feel the inside of your elbow. So not right on the point of the elbow, but the inside of the elbow, that's the point you're feeling. Now if we trace this down, you see a lot of muscles coming from this medial epicondyle of the humerus. And they derive their names from what side of the arm they're on, whether it be radius or ulnar. Also, are they flexors, are they extensors? And do they cross the wrist? Which, remember, the wrist bones are called our carpals. So for starters, your palm, doing that with your palm, that's flexion of your wrist. So these are all in some way going to be, if they're crossing that wrist, they're going to result in flexion. From this point here, we travel down to where it crosses the wrist. There we have the flexor carpi radialis. So flexor, because it flexes the wrist. Carpi, because of the carpal bones and the wrist bones. Radialis, because it travels down the radius side. So flexor carpi radialis. This one over here is called the flexor carpi ulnaris. Flexor carpi ulnaris, same thing, it's a flexor of the carpals or wrist, and it goes down the ulnar side. Under here, this one here that we can see on the top, we don't actually have to, we're not going to learn that one. That one you will not find in your table, only because it actually doesn't exist in a vast majority of the population. It's actually called the palmaris longus, but we're going to leave that for now. When I say it doesn't exist, it doesn't mean you've got a big hole in your arm. It means that sometimes muscles converge into one bigger muscle and sometimes they split into two. So it's not like there's something missing there, but it just means that you've got other muscles which are taking up the slack. You could probably do this simple test by putting your thumb and your pinky together, and you'll notice that tendon for the palmaris longus appears in mine, but if you're doing it there at home, you put your pinky and your thumb together, you'll probably find that tendon, about half of you probably wouldn't have it. So that's an interesting little thing that happens in the body. But underneath that, you've got this one here. It's labelled in there. It's also there. It's travelling all underneath. That's called the flexor digitorum superficialis. So flexor digitorum superficialis, getting its name from the flexor. It's digits, right? It's flexing, it's traveling to our digits, and superficialis meaning it's superficial. Now, as you can see, it's not the most superficial muscle, but it is more superficial than other flexor digitorum muscles which occur underneath. So from the front again, from the top, we've got flexor carpi radialis down the radius side, flexor carpi ulnaris down the ulnar side, and then flexor digitorum superficialis. If I took off that most superficial layer and I traced my thumb, you've got one here running straight to the thumb. That's called the flexor pollicis longus. So it's traveling down and flexing our thumb. So remember, the thumb is called the pollex. So we notice with the pollex muscles, they're always deep. So flexor pollicis longus. And they're the four muscles that cross our wrist that we have to know. Flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris, flexor digitorum superficialis, and then flexor pollicis longus, deep to the thumb. If I turn it over, I'm now looking at the extensors. The most important thing to do first is to rule out this muscle when we're talking about the wrist, because I've labeled this already at the top when I said it was the brachioradialis, because remember it's touching up here the side of the brachialis. So remember that when we're doing the extensors, we remove that first muscle from this equation, and then we do a very similar process. So you'll notice this arrowhead, if you like, all the muscles originating at this point and then traveling down the arm. Using the similar language, we've got the extensor carpi radialis. So now it's extending my carpals down the radius side here. I've got extensor carpi ulnaris traveling down, extending my wrist down the ulnar side. But then on top, the extensor digitorum. So traveling down the middle to all of my digits. So extensor carpi radialis, extensor carpi ulnaris, and extensor digitorum. Using the same process as before to find my thumb muscle, I remove a layer, I trace the thumb, and I'll find my extensor pollicis longus. So again, deep to the pollex, extensor pollicis longus. Now we'll talk about the pronators and supinators, so those muscles of the radii-ulnar joints. So in order to see this clearly, we would need to take off the brachioradialis. So if we remove that, we can clearly see this V formation that's occurring just below the elbow. These two really short muscles that join just below the elbow. On the inside of the arm, so on the palm side, which would turn my palm down, I've got my pronator teres, and that joins or connects really close to this supinator, which is the muscle on the back side of our arm, which would supinate. So the pronator teres and the supinator occurring and connecting and joining together just below the elbow in this V-type formation. At the other end of my wrist, it almost can't be seen. It's like a wristwatch. You see a little glimpse of it in here, and in here, there's a muscle that travels from my radius to my ulna, just directly across like you would wear a watch, but on the palm side. This muscle, this sort of rectangular type muscle, it's deep, it's called the pronator quadratus. So they're the only ones we really have to know for the pronators and supinators. At the top, joining at the V, pronator teres and supinator, and then down at the wrist, but on the inside, traveling from my radius to my ulna, I've got my pronator quadratus. So that concludes this lab, and we learnt a whole lot of muscles, origins and insertions and actions of the upper limb. So we've got, in the upper limb, we had the glenohumeral joint, the elbow joint, and the proximal distal radii-ulnar joints, and our wrist joint and fingers. Wrist joint, correct name there being the radiocarpal joint. So there was a lot of joints, which means sometimes you've got these muscles that are transferring across more than one joint. So they're called two joint muscles if they do that. And in that case, you'll see them on more than one table. So you'll see them on more than one table with different actions represented, possibly at different joints, but you'll see those origins and insertions maintaining the same. So really lock this in before you move on to the next week, because we're going to be piling a whole lot more in the upper and then lower leg. So there's a whole lot more to learn, and this is something you really want to get on top of.